Once upon a time, there was a family who were trying to decide where to go on holiday, Disneyland or Hawaii. So they took a democratic vote on it, and Hawaii won. Unfortunately, those who wanted to go to Disneyland weren't very happy about it. And instead of accepting the result and making the most of the trip, they ranted and raved and moaned and complained and did their utmost to sabotage the entire trip, ultimately ruining it for everyone. The end. This sums up for me the basic situation we're in with Brexit. It's no longer about whether you voted leave or remain. It's now about democracy. Democracy requires losers' consent. But ever since the referendum, I feel like I've been watching Remainers make excuse after excuse justifying to themselves why it's okay to overturn the will of the people. And so that's what this video will be about. I'd like to talk about the importance of democracy and then go through one by one each of the excuses that Remainers make and argue why I think they're wrong. So it seems to me that the most important issue is democracy. Leave won the referendum, and so we must leave the EU. If we don't, I think the consequences of that will be much more dire and far-reaching than what Remainers may fear will happen if we leave the EU. Because democracy is a deeper, more vital issue than the type of trade we do with other countries. Generally in life, the deeper you get to the roots of an issue, the more influential any changes at that level will be. So make changes to branches, it won't affect the tree much, but make changes at the root and the entire tree changes. So protecting democracy is the more pressing issue here because it's closer to the roots. And when you make changes to the roots, it can take a while before you can see the change in the tree. The process is more subtle. So we need to see past the current short-term turbulence to the bigger picture, which is this. If people lose faith in democracy, they're going to turn to other means to have their voices heard, which will devolve the country into a might is right, free-for-all mentality. Whoever shouts the loudest wins. And this will be a far worse situation to be in than it will be if we leave the EU but with democracy intact. If we end up remaining after the people chose to leave and after all of the promises that the referendum result would be respected and upheld, then I think this will cause irreparable damage to the country for decades to come. And in case anyone's forgotten those promises, here's a quick reminder.
The British people have voted to leave the European Union, and their will must be respected. The will of the British people is an instruction that must be delivered. A once-in-a-generation choice, an in or out referendum. When the British people speak, their voice will be respected, not ignored. If we vote to leave, then we will leave. There'll not be another renegotiation and another referendum.
This election isn't about Brexit itself. That issue has been settled. Britain is leaving the EU.
Would we, under Labour, inevitably leave the EU?
Given that we've had a referendum and the public have told us that they want to leave, then we have to leave.
We are leaving. We are no longer going to be a member of the European Union.
Yes, we're leaving the European Union.
We are leaving the European Union.
We're leaving the European Union.
We are leaving the European Union.
When we leave the European Union.
When we leave the European Union.
As we exit the EU.
As we leave the EU, because that is what the people have voted for.
The Labour Party accepts that we are leaving the European Union.
We have to recognise we're leaving the European Union.
We are leaving the European Union.
The most important question this country has faced for the last 50 years is whether
we will confirm to the other member states that Britain is leaving the European Union. That issue is not in doubt.
Well, the referendum has happened. The country has chosen to leave the EU.
The choice in this election is not Brexit or no Brexit. That has been settled.
do you actually want to leave the EU?
Well, I don't think... We're very clear on Brexit. A referendum took place, a decision was reached, we're leaving the European Union.
The Labour Party will leave the European Union. That is clear, because we respect the democratic mandate of the people.
The Labour Party, and I've been very clear from the outset, that we accept the outcome of the referendum.
Respects the result of our referendum in that we're leaving the European Union.
We had a decision, and we respect the decision.
Our view on Brexit is obviously we respect the vote.
Have we got to accept the result? Yes. But accept and genuinely accept the outcome of the referendum.
We accept the results of the referendum. It's taken place. It's happened. We accept it.
But the Labour Party cannot spend all of its time trying to rub out yesterday and not accept a result which is honour bound to respect. We do accept it, we respect it.
And the Labour Party position is clear, is that we respect the votes of the referendum.
And I'm not prepared now for the Labour Party not to accept the result and genuinely accept the result.
Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. As I have said, Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit.
So democracy is the most vital issue here. It may not be a perfect system, but it's the best humanity has got right now because all other systems have failed. The majority of the world's countries are democratic. Democracies are richer, healthier, happier, better educated, and are better at protecting human rights. So I think people need to think very carefully about challenging this. Even if you believe the choice that the people democratically made is a bad one, to ignore it or overturn it by force or otherwise is to necessarily move towards dictatorship yourself and away from democracy. The act of nullifying the democratic will of the people is itself a dictatorial, anti-democratic act. You won't be able to just go back to democracy again as normal on the other side. You are also making the claim that you know better than the majority of the people, which, while that may always be a possibility, it's more likely that you're wrong. So, I'd like to go through all the ways in which Remainers have been trying to justify why it's okay to subvert the democratic will of the people, and the way I see it is like this. Think about temptation. All of us at one point or another have probably been in a situation where we really, really want something, but we can't have it. And when you're in this situation, you very quickly discover how intelligent you never knew you were. Because your brain will come up with all kinds of excuses to try to find exceptions to rules and to justify why it's okay on this occasion to abandon your principles and get the thing you want. You'll say things to yourself like, oh, it doesn't really count, or we're only breaking the rules a little bit, etc. And it's a slippery slope. Each little lie leads to another and another, until suddenly we're in a situation where we're in today, where people are just outright campaigning to overturn and ignore the referendum result without a hint of shame about it. And this is what I'm hearing when I listen to these excuses. So, the first excuse was from the early days, when the Remainers argued that the referendum should have required a 2/3 majority because of the magnitude of the decision. But I reject this, because firstly, nobody was objecting to this before the vote. It was only after the vote that people began to say this, which suggests to me that they're not being entirely genuine when raising the point. And secondly, I don't think it's true, because the magnitude of the potential dangers involved were equal on both sides. In Remainers' minds, they obviously believe that leaving is the more dangerous path, but in Leavers' minds, remaining is the more dangerous path. Leavers could have easily argued that the decision to throw away our independence and national sovereignty is of such importance that it should require a 2/3 majority in favour of it to pass too. At the time of the vote, we were half in, half out of the EU, so I think a simple majority referendum was perfectly fair and right, and again, nobody objected to this until after they'd lost. A second objection that was popular in the early days was that most old people tended to vote Leave while young people voted Remain, and therefore this is evidence that Remain was the better choice, because presumably old people are stupid while young people are intelligent. But in my mind, I deduced the exact opposite conclusion. In most cultures around the world, the elder citizens are revered and are often turned to for their wise counsel. Older people tend to be wiser because they've lived more and seen more, whereas young people tend to be naive and overconfident. So the fact that most old people voted Leave actually gives me more confidence that Leave was probably the wiser choice to make. It may also be said that because this is a question about our future, the opinions of older people count less, and some have suggested that over the years, as more old people die and more young people reach voting age, the Remain numbers will grow. But I think that's forgetting the fact that people tend to become more conservative as they age. So there'll likely be many people in their 30s and 40s who will be switching from Remain to Leave as they become more conservative. As the famous maxim goes, any man who is under 30 and is not a liberal has no heart, and any man who is over 30 and is not a conservative has no brains. A third excuse coupled with this is that demographically it was shown that Remain voters were better educated than Leave voters, and therefore presumably they know better. But I'm not so sure that mattered as much as some may think, because the nature of the question was really quite simple. Do you want the UK to be independent, or do you want to become more like a state in the United States of Europe? And you don't need an economics degree to be entitled to have your say on a question like that. That's something that every citizen in the UK has a right to answer. I also often find in life that when you explore some of life's greatest problems, the solutions are often surprisingly simple. Scientists have been known to comment on this, that despite all the complexities of the universe, the physical laws once discovered often have a simple beauty to them. And it's like the cosmological argument for God's existence. Theologians can debate till they're blue in the face all of the subtle minutiae surrounding the issue. But at its core, even a child intuits the problem when they ask the question why over and over again. So I think there's an intuitive intelligence that all of us share, and the referendum question was of that nature. Now, some may argue that less educated people are more easily duped, but I actually believe in this referendum it was the Remainers who were the ones who were duped by the mainstream narrative. There is a heavy Remain dominance in places of influence in this country, in universities, corporations, the media and political establishments. David Goodhart, amongst others, has documented this in his book The Road to Somewhere. And the unmistakable message that was being pumped to the public was that Remain represented love, peace and unity, while Leave represented hate, xenophobia and separation. So anyone who voted to Leave had to do so against this torrent of disapproval. They had to overcome this almighty fear of ostracisation to cast their vote. And yet, despite this, Leave still won. So I think Remain was the more conformist vote, the one that had the support from the establishment and the most cheer and goodwill surrounding it. And I'd suggest that perhaps it was precisely the more humble circumstances of the average Leave voter that equipped them with less fear of nonconformity, as for many they had less to lose status-wise, so were better able to see through the media smoke. A variant of this is a fourth excuse, which is that we weren't informed enough, that the question was too complicated and we didn't know what might happen next. Now, as I just said, I think the question was more of an intuitive nature, but I have some further responses I'd like to add to this particular objection. Firstly, nobody can predict the future, so if your definition of being informed means having a comprehensive guaranteed outline of all future events, then your definition of being informed is too high. We all knew there were risks involved in leaving, and we all knew there were risks involved in remaining, and we made our choice. Secondly, both sides were as informed as the other. For every underinformed leaver, there was an underinformed remainer, and for every well-informed leaver, there was a well-informed remainer. That's one of the strengths of democracy. It balances all the imperfections out. And thirdly, when people use this argument, it generally just makes me think that they weren't informed, because personally I felt I was informed plenty. so perhaps this objection is more reflective of the one raising it than the country as a whole. A fifth excuse was that we were lied to. The Leave campaign lied to us, and therefore the referendum is unfair and should be rerun. But I believe this is overblown. I think there were lies on both sides, but the Remain lies haven't been put under the same scrutiny because Remain lost, so there's been no need. But I could easily argue that the Remain side were guilty of the largest deception of all. Due to the strong Remain bias in the media and positions of influence, they were able to push this idea that a vote to stay symbolised love and unity and peace, while a vote to leave symbolised hate, xenophobia and separation. And I think that was a far more serious manipulation of the truth than a dubious figure on the side of a bus. Let me pose a challenge. Can you tell me, to the nearest 100 grand, how much the UK spends on defence or education each week? Because if you can't, then I think your outrage is phony. To pretend that the figure deceived you when you're unaware of the precise proportion of the budget it represents, I think you're just using it as an excuse. I don't think the exact figure meant an awful lot to most people. What was important was the basic point behind the figure, which is that we're going to get a load of money back from the EU from not paying our membership fee, so let's spend a chunk of it on the NHS. So saying we were lied to, I think, is a disingenuous attempt to have the referendum rerun. It's just like in sports when a team loses. The fans immediately look for excuses to blame it on. They look for injustices, the ref screwed us, he was offside, etc. But this is just human nature. In reality, there were just as many distortions from the Remain side, so I think it balanced out. I don't approve of it, but sadly it's the state of politics today. All politicians manipulate the truth to suit their own agenda, and both sides were guilty of it. A sixth attempt to overturn the result is to call for a second referendum. But I reject this again for several reasons. Firstly, I think it would be a huge betrayal. During the referendum, we were clearly and repeatedly assured by the government that this would be a one-time, once-in-a-lifetime vote, that there wouldn't be a second vote. David Cameron famously said that this was a referendum, not a neverendum. Then after Leave won, all parties were unanimous in their intent to respect and implement the will of the people. It was the biggest democratic exercise in British history, so to be made to vote again I think would be a huge betrayal and would damage trust across the country irrevocably. Secondly, a large reason why people feel justified in calling for a second referendum is because of the turmoil the process has caused so far. They want to ask people, did you really vote for this? But the leading cause of all the turmoil has been Remainer resistance and their constant subversion of the Brexit process. If Remainers had respected democracy from the outset and granted losers' consent as is proper, then they'd have stepped back and let the Brexiteers rightly steer the ship, as they're the ones who know the way and believe in it. I'm sure the sailing would have been far smoother had that have been the case. And it wouldn't surprise me if this had been a deliberate tactic by Remainers all along, to cause as much disruption as possible in the hopes that the country would turn back, which is a particularly reprehensible thing to do in my opinion if it is the case. Thirdly, the nature of the question is such that it should only be asked once in a generation at least, because we can't keep messing the EU about, flip-flopping in and out whenever we like. It's not like a general election, where regular votes are appropriate to steer the country through the myriad of changing domestic issues and to hold the government to account. This is a question of identity, and the people have spoken. There was only one referendum in 1975, and there should only be one now. Fourthly, we've lost objectivity now. At the time of the original vote, we had objectivity. We had two paths laid out ahead of us, and we made our choice. But now we've started down the path to leaving, we've tasted some of the turmoil that would now taint a second vote. For a second vote to be truly fair, we'd have to travel into a parallel future universe to taste the turmoil of remaining in the EU too. The political unrest, the protests, the tyranny, etc. Obviously that's hypothetical, but my point is that at the time of the original vote, the last 3 years were also hypothetical. So we've lost that objectivity now. Now you could say, but aren't we allowed to change our minds? But for me at this stage, it just demonstrates cowardice and cold feet more than anything else. And we haven't even left yet. It's like the scene in Lord of the Rings when they're trying to decide whether to go over or under a mountain, and Frodo decides they should go under, through the mines of Moria. Well, imagine if as soon as it got a little tough, they thought, actually, screw this, let's go over the mountain. What makes them think the same wouldn't happen when they tried to go over too? As soon as it got a little tough again, they changed their minds again. What they need is conviction and courage to stand up for what they decided was best while they still had objectivity and their decisions weren't being swayed by fear. So I think a second referendum would be a huge betrayal and would be extremely improper. A seventh method they use is scaremongering. In life we have principles that guide us. But if you ramp up the stakes, eventually you'll get to a point where a person will feel justified in abandoning their principles. So, for example, stealing is wrong. But if you're starving enough and haven't eaten for weeks, and you're passing a billion-dollar bread factory where there are millions of loaves of bread, suddenly it might not seem so wrong to just steal one little loaf of bread. Well, I think scaremongering is being used in a similar way by Remainers. They say, yes, democracy is important, but in this case, leaving the EU would be so catastrophic that it's justified to abandon democracy. But I reject this. I don't think we're anywhere near being justified to abandon democracy. Firstly, we've all seen how often the fearmongers have been wrong in the past. They were wrong about the euro, they were wrong about Norway's referendum, they were wrong about the after effects of the 2016 Brexit vote. So my faith in these gloomy projections is really weak. Secondly, even some of the worst case scenario projections don't seem that bad in my opinion. And the Bank of England has just recently revised a projection saying that a no-deal Brexit won't be as bad as they feared, due to the preparations that the government are now putting in place. Which goes to show you that these government preparations obviously weren't anticipated or factored into the original Bank of England projections. Which also shows you how these projections can often go wrong. Most projections show that the UK would continue to grow, but just not as fast as it would if they remained in the EU. So this is hardly a crisis. And I'm actually even very sceptical that that would be the case anyway. Personally, I feel really optimistic about our economic future outside the EU, because we can start trading with the rest of the world. And remember, only Antarctica and I think Latin America are experiencing worse economic growth than Europe. Every other continent in the world is experiencing much faster growth, and we'll finally be free to trade with them. And one final point about scaremongering to remember is that people use it to make their point stronger. Catastrophizing sells papers and grabs attention and wins arguments, and both sides are guilty of it. The truth is, all we're talking about is a political and economic arrangement with the EU. Leave or remain, I don't think either scenario in reality would be that catastrophic, and certainly not worth compromising our democratic principles over. An eighth angle they employ is a more recent one, where it's claimed that nobody said we would leave without a deal, that there's no mandate for a no deal. But again, I think this is untrue. Remainers were the ones during the referendum who seemed to love reminding the public at every opportunity that if you vote to leave, there's no guarantee we'll get a deal at all. And it was incumbent on the Brexiteers to argue otherwise. Most Brexiteers said we probably would get a deal, and I still think we probably will eventually, even if we leave without a deal first. Eventually we'll get a deal because it's in the EU's interest to do so too. But I think it was clear to most that a vote to leave meant there would always be a risk we could leave without a deal at all, because the Remainers loved reminding us of it so much. And in case you'd forgotten, here's a little reminder. This is from the Telegraph on the 22nd of February 2016. The headline reads, "Sorry Boris, a vote to leave means we leave. The EU rules are crystal clear. A referendum vote to get out would mean Brexit, not talks on a new deal." And this is from the Mirror on the 3rd of June 2016. The UKIP leader admits EU leaders could turn round and say no deal 2 years after a leave vote, and he'll be just fine with that. This one's from The Guardian on 12th of June 2016. European Council President dismisses claims by Vote Leave campaign that a new deal with EU could be struck quickly, and later says there's no guarantee of success. And here's an article in the BBC from the 2nd of March 2016 where Philip Hammond, in a speech made to Chatham House, warns that there would be no guarantee the UK could reach a deal within the 2-year limit. So I think the public were forewarned plenty that no deal would always be a risk. It's also worth remembering that MPs voted overwhelmingly in favour of triggering Article 50, in which it states that if a deal is not reached at the end of the 2-year negotiating period, then we must leave without a deal. So either people are suffering from a staggering case of mass amnesia, or they're telling porkies, and I suspect the latter. Coupled with this is the 9th deception, which is currently gripping Remainers, and it's this idea that leaving the EU without a deal would be so catastrophic that we have to make a law to prevent it happening. Now, this one, unless I'm missing something, in my mind strikes me as being absolutely mental. Firstly, I don't think it'll be anywhere near as catastrophic as people are making out, as I mentioned previously. Even the government's Yellowhammer worst case scenario contingency plans don't sound that disastrous to me. But secondly, it just seems like a really crazy thing to make a law about. Imagine if the tables were turned and the UK were the economically dominant nation and the EU were the little weaklings straggling behind. Now imagine if all the little worried EU MPs frantically passed a law making it illegal for them to divorce the UK without a deal. We'd look down at them and think, hang on, you can't just make a law guaranteeing a deal. What if we don't want to give you a deal? We might want to walk away. You can't force us to have a deal with you. We're not subject to your laws. That would be my first response, but then my second response would be, okay then, actually, if you're legally bound to have a deal with us, how about this deal? You owe us £100 billion a year and you must become our slaves for all eternity. How does that sound? Obviously the EU wouldn't like it, but what could they do? They'd have to accept. If they object, the UK would have no reason to budge an inch. They could just say, that's our deal, take it or leave it. And the EU would be forced to either accept it or break their own law. I mean, it's absolute madness in my mind, and it's honestly exasperating that so many people in the country can't see this. I think it's either a bold-faced attempt to deny the democratic will of the people and keep us in the EU, or these Remain MPs are somehow so enslaved by the EU that they've developed a weird case of Stockholm syndrome, where they're acting like a battered wife who keeps making justifications in defence of her abusive husband, terrified to leave him for fear of what he might do to her. So it's either treacherous or pathetic. I can't tell which, but neither is good. So I'm utterly mystified by this one. But moving on. Linked to this is a 10th excuse where it's argued that nobody voted for us to be poorer. Now, firstly, imagine if the Allies refused to go to war against Hitler on the grounds that it'd make the country poorer. That would be an incredibly shameful excuse to make. There are some things in life that are more important than money, such as national unity and well-being and preserving our democracy and freedoms. These things are worth taking an economic hit over. I also think people lose perspective so easily. The standard of life for the average person in the UK is astronomically high when looked at through the lens of history. Even the poorest of us have more wealth than the vast majority of people who have ever lived. And yet here we are, about to just cast aside the principles of democracy and national sovereignty that our grandparents gave their lives fighting to protect, all for a few fractions of a percentage point of growth in GDP. And I'm not even so sure that we will be poorer anyway. As I said earlier, I think the UK's prospects outside the EU are incredibly exciting. Angela Merkel just recently issued a warning to the EU that the UK could become the new Singapore of Europe, attracting international investment at their expense. And Trump has been really positive about a US-UK trade deal, so I'm very positive about it all. An 11th way in which the Remainers have been trying to subvert the referendum result is through the use of language. Bankers' Brexit, the people's vote, stop the coup. These are all manipulative ways of twisting the narrative, and it bewilders me how many people are taken in by this. Firstly, Bankers' Brexit. Back in 2016, the narrative from Remainers was that the vote leave demographic was dominated by poor, stupid, working class people. But now they're trying to claim that it's the rich bankers who are behind it all, which I think is particularly cheeky considering the Remain campaign was funded by Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Citibank and Morgan Stanley. And calling the second referendum the people's vote, I find obnoxiously arrogant. Who do they think voted in the first referendum? The people have already spoken. A more apt name I would suggest would be something more like the EU's Make and Vote Again vote, but I doubt that will catch on. And the Stop the Coup protest I find to be very hypocritical, because the only reason they're protesting the prorogation of Parliament is because they want it left open so they can stop Brexit and overturn the original vote, which is the real coup that's happening right now. I think the outrage over prorogation is phony because of the 24 days Parliament will be closed, 18 were going to be closed for conferences anyway. And it's only controversial to people who think Brexit will be an utter catastrophe and are desperately trying to sabotage the whole process. But to the majority of the rest of us, there's a country to run and ordinary business to attend to. I'll admit when Boris first announced his plan to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks, I thought it was a bit audacious, but now that I've looked into the details, I don't think it's anything too controversial. I suspect there's probably a little more to Boris's intentions that he's letting on, but the reaction of the Remainers is just grandstanding in my opinion. And the 12th and final legal challenge Remainers have made is to ask, what does leave really mean anyway? And to this one I would actually grant a slight concession, because I think it's true that a variety of paths out of the EU could all technically be classed as leaving. There's a clean break, no deal Brexit. There's the Norway or Switzerland models. There's a Canada-style free trade agreement. So there is some ambiguity there. But I think an honest approach would be to at least plump for somewhere in the middle. If we're more tied to the EU than Norway or Switzerland, then I think that would represent a failure of the people. Personally, I think a simple Canada-style free trade agreement is the most obvious path we should take, because anything that keeps us tied to the single market or customs union would mean we'd still have to pay the membership fee, abide by EU law, accept free movement of people, and we wouldn't be able to strike up our own trade deals. So in my eyes that wouldn't be Brexit. So I think a simple free trade agreement would be best, but obviously that's looking pretty unlikely right now, so I think a no deal is now our best option, because the deal the EU are offering us sounds awful and would effectively turn us into a vassal state. And as long as Remainers keep undermining our negotiating position, they're not going to budge an inch. And so that's 12 attempts that Remainers have made to try to justify overturning the will of the people. And I believe all of them fall short. So for me, the bottom line still remains. The people voted to leave, and so we must leave if we're to preserve our democracy. Democracy requires losers' consent. That doesn't mean Remainers have to deny their convictions or stop debating, but it does mean they shouldn't be disrespecting the majority will of their fellow countrymen by actively plotting against them. Because to still be pushing to remain after the people have spoken is to be in contempt of democracy itself. You are saying that you don't care about the majority will of your country. You are declaring yourself to be an anti-democrat. And if society is to have any moral boundaries, this should surely be a central one. I've been utterly staggered by how brazenly some people are just openly campaigning to overturn the referendum result now, and how often this is going uncondemned in the media, especially MPs who are supposed to be role models, and extra specially Joe Swinson, who is the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party. Is that not now the most hypocritically named party in the world? Imagine if the Lib Dems won the next general election by 1.8%, and they were over the moon and excitedly anticipating their first days in Parliament and entering number 10. They'd been the little ignored underdogs for years, bullied in Parliament, never having their voices heard, but now finally their time has come. Then imagine if the Conservatives said, "Sorry, I'm afraid there's a few constitutional technicalities that need sorting out before you can take office. It'll only take a few months." So you wait patiently, but as you're waiting for that to be sorted, you begin getting attacks that your campaign was full of lies, and you're taken to court and have to deal with legal battles that drag on for more months. And all the while this is occurring, there are smear campaigns and all kinds of malicious attacks being stirred up in the media, slowly turning the public against you. And before you know it, 3 years have passed, and the Conservatives are now saying, look, it's been 3 years, the people may have changed their minds now, let's just have another vote on it to settle it. All of this, and you haven't even stepped foot in number 10 yet. How would you feel if you were a Lib Dem supporter? Well, multiply that by 10 and add a few servings of rage, and that's how most Brexiteers are feeling right now. But that's all I have to say for now. So thank you for listening if you made it this far. Feel free to leave comments, and I'll see you later.